Are you recording? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose good morning for some of you, including for our presenter and others who may be joining us from Singapore or elsewhere, where it's still morning. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Csilla Weninger, who is also happy for her surname to be pronounced as Weninger. So she's very okay with different pronunciations, she told us earlier. Csilla is an associate professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the National Institute of Education in Singapore at Nanyang Technological University. And she comes, like me, from a background in linguistics and someone who has expertise in critical discourse analysis. And in the last quite a few years now, she has been applying these expertise to explore the institutional and political ideologies in language and literacy or literacies education. And this is something that she will be presenting on today, thinking about critical literacy in particular and the contextual realities of critical literacy and whether critical literacy is indeed something that is desirable and possible to enact in our classrooms at, I suppose, different levels of education, although her most recent research has focused on critical literacy in high school classrooms, in secondary school. She has quite, well, some of you maybe may know Csilla from her publications in focusing on the critical discourse analysis of foreign language textbooks. And this is how I first came across her work. But as I said, more recently, she's been focusing on English as a high school subject, as a subject in high school, and critical literacy in particular. And I forgot to mention that this seminar is hosted jointly by the School of Education and the Multilingualism Research Center. We are trying a slightly different format in that we hope that Csilla would present for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have some time for discussion with some questions from me, but then also open up for a Q&A. So please feel free to post any questions you have in the chat as well, so that you don't forget your questions, and then we'll hopefully have time to address them towards the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand over to Csilla for her presentation. Thank you, Csilla.
Okay, thank you, Emilia, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, the usual Zoom question, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this presentation is going to be based on research that I have been doing in Singapore classrooms for the last 5-6 years through my involvement in various projects, some of which I was leading, some of which I was kind of a collaborator on. And a lot of this research really kind of centered on the idea of how can we, like Emilia said, how can we push literacy education in the classrooms beyond what teachers and students are currently doing. And this is a very, very important question in Singapore, I feel, and I'll tell you later why. I will not be talking a whole lot about the specifics of the research that this presentation is based on, but if you would like to find out more about the research, here are some relevant publications. Okay, I don't know about you, but every time I teach, every time I talk to teachers about critical literacy, the usual question is, the usual response that I get from teachers is, okay, I really like the idea of critical literacy, but I'm not comfortable talking about race in my classroom. Or, yes, I would really like to try critical literacy as a teacher in my classroom, but how can I really squeeze this into an already busy curriculum or lesson. Or I would love to try critical literacy, something that I think my students would respond to, but my head of department or my school would not support it. And I think underlying these questions is often this idea that critical literacy has to kind of be about the big issues, right? Like we have to critique race, we have to critique poverty, or we have to critique, world inequality. And certainly, I think critical literacy can be about that. And if you're familiar with the critical literacy literature, in fact, there have been many studies where teachers, researchers have successfully tackled those big questions in the format of, specifically English language education in mainstream classrooms. But it doesn't always have to be about those topics. I mean, that's going to be kind of my key argument throughout this talk, which is that exactly what we are critical about, kind of what is the target for critical literacy, is something that we need to establish locally in light of what is contextually relevant to our students and our teachers, and perhaps even more importantly, what is contextually possible. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about critical literacy, although I assume most of you will have some ideas about what critical literacy is. One way to do that is by talking about what might be called uncritical literacy. And uncritical literacy, really underlying this notion, is a view of language as a neutral medium for communication. In this idea, in this approach to language and language education, language just reflects the world, right? So when we learn to use language in its written and print form, what we need to do really is to learn the best or most appropriate ways in which we can reflect this existing world out there. And so language education then becomes all about mastery of these appropriate forms of communication in a type of literacy that's really more about replication than anything else. If in a classroom setting, this is the literacy view that we are taking, then it's also quite clear that the identities available to our students within this view of literacy education often revolve around their level of mastery of this appropriate form of language and communication, of writing and reading mostly. And so we view students, and students come to view themselves as gifted writers. And they of course internalize these labels as I'm a poor speller, but I'm a slow reader, I'm a great reader, I'm a above level reader. Critical literacy, on the other hand, sees the world in a very different light, underlying critical literacy is an idea of language as actively involved in the control of world. And those of you familiar with critical literacy, critical discourse analysis, of course, this is a very, very fundamental idea. Excuse me. So when we learn to use language, especially in its written or multimodal form, we are not only replicating an existing reality, or we shouldn't just be replicating this existing reality, but rather we should be understanding reading and writing as acts of meaning, acts of representation. And of course, every act of representation is inherently political because it involves choices. Again, if this is the basis for systemic functional linguistics, for critical discourse analysis, and also its kind of educational parallel, which is critical literacy. So if this is the view of language that we take, then language education within critical literacy really becomes targeted at raising students' awareness to meaning making as a political act, as an act of representation, and hopefully not only raising their awareness, but also inviting them to then question what we may call the sociolinguistic order, question these systems of representation that they encounter in school and also out of school. In this view of literacy education, then students don't simply become associated or labeled in relation to their mastery of these skills, but rather we invite them and we give them the opportunity to become critical readers and writers, and through that, hopefully positively be able to positively change the world, make a positive change. like I said before, a lot of research out there on critical literacy has kind of tackled or aimed to tackle these global themes, these global issues that clearly are affecting all of us. And this is a very partial list here. Certainly, I think all of us could relate to any of these items on the list as kind of impacting or existing in our own context to various degrees and in various forms. But what my research kind of has somewhat disappointingly or sadly demonstrated is that it's really impossible to jump from these global themes and go straight to the classroom. So it's not possible, it's not feasible, at least not according to what I have found, to just take these contexts, take these global issues, let's say poverty or global warming, and try to do something with that in the classroom. It's not going to be sustainable. There is a whole range of contextual layers between that global issue and what can happen and will happen in the classroom. And we really have to filter these themes through these different contextual layers. And these contextual layers that I have here listed are in no way, the only ones possible. These are just the one I'm going to be talking about, and these are the ones that have helped me think through some of these issues in my own research. Okay, so the question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to kind of carry through the next few slides, several slides, is, what are the possible issues and questions that we need to consider at each of these kind of contextual levels for critical literacy to be a viable educational practice. So one possible and very important question in my view at the national level is to ask, how does national leaders, how does national policy envision the role of education, and specifically in my case, in the case of language educators, the role of language education? And historically, and in terms of scholarship and educational philosophy, there are really two dominant themes here, possibilities, if you like. One that sees education as preparation for civic life. And this, of course, is very strongly rooted in John Dewey's educational philosophy, but also is carried very strongly within the theme of critical literacy and critical pedagogy. Education classrooms should be stages, rehearsals for what happens in real life. Parallel to that, there's also kind of a philosophy that sees the role of education as preparation for work, as preparing the workforce, equipping students with skills that will make them productive participants in the national and global economy. These two are, as my diagram indicates, they're not exclusive. I think definitely in Singapore they coexist, and I think they probably exist in some kind of uneasy tension in most, because they can be in tension in most educational contexts. So let's look at Singapore. Like what do things look like in Singapore in terms of national vision, in terms of like preparing citizens? There's definitely a push in the Ministry of Education's vision for education to be this kind of vehicle to nurture citizens. And if you look at the part that's highlighted, of course, it is a very particular vision for citizenship, right? It's a vision that sees students as being molded into good citizens, into a type of citizen who is conscious of responsibilities, right? This idea, this philosophy trickles down into subject syllabi as well. If you look at the English language syllabus, which is a brand new syllabus just being implemented this year for the first time, these are the core values that teachers are asked to infuse into their teaching of the English language. And I think we can all rally behind ideas of values of respect or care or harmony. But if you look at this in the previous slide, it very clearly signals a vision of citizenship that you can see how that might be problematic or have some kind of tension with critical literacy's effort or critical literacy's impetus for students to be change makers, right? To kind of not be afraid to critique established systems of representation. And it's certainly something that I have found in my research. In Singapore, at the same time, we see very definite undisputable connections between education and the economy. And I mean, it's not a secret. This is not some kind of hidden ideology. The government has always said that they're very much interested in aligning kind of national educational goals with the needs of the national economy. In Singapore, this is partially, human resource, like I mentioned, or it was on my slides, human capital theory, right? Which is a theory that emerged in the 1960s that sees kind of education as the pathway to economic success, both at the individual and at the national level. And this kind of narrative is very, very prevalent in Singapore. And so much so, in fact, that a lot of parents and teachers see education, I would say, in general, as the gateway to upward economic mobility. And we have the ideology of meritocracy, which is very much entrenched in the education system. Lots of people have written about it. People have critiqued it, of course, as well. And in order to ensure meritocracy, the educational system does rely on standardized examinations, heavy dose of standardized examinations throughout the levels of education. So you can see again how some of these kind of characteristics of the national level will obviously impact what you can do in a system that places high values on national examinations and standardized exams. What's going to happen in the classroom is going to have an effect on what teachers and students are willing and capable and have time to do in the classroom, specifically, when we think about critical literacy. But I think these factors are not only operational in Singapore. I think all of us need to, if we want to embark on critical literacy as educational practice, classroom practice, we need to ask these questions. To what extent are the goals of critical literacy compatible with the educational philosophy or educational ethos of our own educational establishment, right? How will these national level sentiments or policies, if you like, mitigate these global themes as targets for critical literacy? Let's talk a little bit about the institutional level. And here I would like to talk a little bit about the role of subject culture. And subject culture has been defined as, values, expectations, and practices that are shared within a community of practitioners. So in this case, you could talk about the subject culture of English in Singapore. I like the notion of subject culture as kind of a way to think about this, because it really emphasizes the systemic nature of how these things work. I think so often, and I'm definitely guilty of this as well, we kind of critique teachers, right? We're quick to say, oh, this teacher, this and that and the other, they're not able to do this because of their educational beliefs, because of their, they like their routine. But, where do those things come from? They're not necessarily individual pathologies, so to speak, but rather emerge from the teachers being steeped within this subject culture of English. And I think the subject culture is way more variable depending on context than, let's say, the role of education. And of course, that's an assumption, I must say. But I've seen, just from others' research, that this can be very, very different. So what is the subject culture of English like in Singapore? I'm not sure if how many of you know, but the subjects of English literature and language are entirely separate school subjects. And if you're teaching English language, it doesn't mean that you will be teaching English literature. The teacher training for the two subjects is separate at the undergraduate. And well, now we have a Master of English, which kind of combines the two, but typically students who come for the masters tend to veer, into either the literature or the language direction. So, and English language is represented in the curriculum in a much higher number of hours than English literature. And it's also compulsory throughout the educational trajectory of students, but not so for literature. There's a lot of research done by Singaporean researchers, educational researchers, that shows that English language, as it is taught as a school subject, is often kind of text and skills driven and is fairly decontextualized. Another thing that I have kind of talked about that I think is not something that people often consider is that there seems to be, again, because of that kind of national influence on, on examinations and on syllabus, international syllabus, a lot of teachers have this kind of bureaucratic procedural mindset, right? They're all about efficiency. They're all about, as they say, delivering content. They're all about, it's in the discourse, in the way in which they talk about their role, their jobs, right? And there's also a meticulous adherence to syllabus, like little bitty details within the syllabus, like individual language skills. And it's like always check mark, we've done this, we've done that. And this kind of mindset, again, like what is this going to do when you get to something like critical literacy, where it's really the big picture should come first in a way, right? You need to think big, you need to connect things, you need to be able to contextualize issues and themes. And I feel like this kind of procedural mentality is very difficult to reconcile with the pedagogy that is required by critical literacy. Just to illustrate, here's Lynn, who is a teacher of over 20 years, with over 20 years of experience. And I asked her in an interview, how do you see your role as an English teacher? And she was the head of the department in a secondary school for English. And this is what she had to say. She says, the challenge is the application of the skills that they cover. Can my students apply whatever skills or structures or language features that we teach the class? So it feels good when I see their work and it's like, okay, you got it right now and the structure is good. Imparting those skills is, I feel, very important. Now, this is, of course, one single interview, but it really captures, I think, that some of the points that I've been raising here about this focus on skills and structures. And so this is kind of the subject culture level. So the questions that I think could be relevant to all of us are, let's step back and look at subject culture, right? What are the values, aims, and practices that characterize the subject culture that exists in our context? And importantly, how do they impact pedagogy, the teachers, and teachers' professional identity? That is how they come to see themselves. And these are important questions because it's teachers who are going to be enacting the critical literacy lesson plans or curricula, right? So if this is something that goes against their sense of what English teaching should be about, that there's going to be some issues. Those tensions are going to show. And I talk about this, and I show this in a recent paper, how this kind of plays out in classroom interaction. Okay, so I have talked about the national level. I have talked about the subject culture level, and now I would like to talk about the classroom level. So what, as I have said, some of what you see here on these slides kind of sums up research, not just mine, research in the last 15 years of what characterizes pedagogy in Singapore classrooms. Overwhelmingly, classrooms are teacher-fronted in Singapore. There's a clear dominance. At least this is research from about 10 years ago, but I'm not sure if any more research has been done, large-scale research about the dominance of the initiation, response, evaluation sequence, right? That kind of typical classroom interactional pattern that we see and that we associate with kind of display questions and not really enabling dialogic teaching or discussion. There is a prevalence of worksheet culture. I find that not English teachers don't use textbooks, for example. A lot of them use, binders full of worksheets that they hand out to students. So it's very common for students to accumulate, hundreds of these worksheets over the school year. Now, Singapore's approach, a lot of schools in Singapore use this kind of model of purpose, audience, context, culture to deal with text, right? But what I think I have observed and what others have observed is that usually they don't really go beyond purpose and audience, right? So there's context and culture very much get short shrift, right? So the main thing is, and this is what people have called a decontextualized approach, right? So here's a text, what is the purpose, who is the audience, but nothing beyond that, right? It's very much a language structural focus still. And I must say, this is despite, the latest English language syllabus is quite progressive. It's what we might call a sociolinguistically informed syllabus, but there's a big difference between, I think, the spirit of the national syllabus and what happens in many classrooms. So this excerpt is from a conversation I had with students, Singapore secondary 3 students, about a lesson that they had just had. And this lesson, actually the whole unit was focused on body image, right? So this is an English language classroom. This is one of the elite schools, by the way. So I was asking them, what about this unit? This was really exciting. They talked about body image, media representations and things like that. So I asked them, recently, body and media image, media and body image was a topic. Do you see this as connecting to your lives? And then I get kind of lukewarm responses from the students. And then I try to probe them, like, okay, well, what do you think? Does it feel like homework, or is it stuff that you're actually interested in, where you're like, oh, wow, that's me? And then flatly, Alan just says, oh, it's just schoolwork. Doesn't the topic speak to you? The topic, yes, but it's the work that comes after. So again, I think it's something that I have found a lot of time in my research with the schools. The topic, yes, but the schoolwork, it's kind of, beating it to death, beating the text to death. Like how can you take something that's kind of potentially interesting, but then the work that students are required to do around that topic, around the theme, it then goes back straight to this kind of decontextualized work. Again, the point here is, it is not a big surprise, right? Given what I have just said about the national level, the institutional level, it's not too big of a surprise that we see pedagogical patterns such as this. And the last piece I want to briefly talk about before we turn it over to discussion is the role of students. I feel like, and I'm not the first one to say this, but there's not enough talk about, what is the role, what is the stake for students in critical literacy specifically, but also I think in literacy education more generally. Definitely students are positioned in critical literacy as a central aspect of pedagogy, in that we are encouraged to consider their context and experiences as kind of the basis, as resources for critical literacy classroom work. Again, what I have found in Singapore, how this played out in Singapore, that on the one hand, yes, students would love to have literacy education that has so-called real-world relevance, that speaks to them, that helps them be, better communicators out there, that helps them be more reflective, and literacy education that deals with the types of literacies that they encounter outside, right? This is kind of the whole idea also behind multiliteracies. But at the same time, students are also acutely aware that schools are primarily or mainly or partially vehicles for them to get ahead, right? And remember I said all that stuff about the importance of examinations and the pathway, education as the pathway to economic advancement. And so when you have a kind of a contextual milieu like that, then students will expect that school will prepare them for examinations. And so in Singapore, there is this kind of interesting coexistence between students yearning for real-world relevance and what we might call authentic learning, what the literature is calling authentic learning. But for them, authentic also means, the school has its own authenticity, which is, yes, help me do better on the exams. And if you ask students, would you like to have interesting lessons and real-world relevance, or lessons that prepare for you for the exam, many students will choose the latter. So it's, in a situation like this, what do you do in terms of critical literacy? So again, thinking about students as well. This is from a forthcoming paper that Victor, who's in the audience, and I and a colleague are writing. Again, just to add another facet to this kind of complexity of students' attitudes or students' take on this, right? So here's a secondary student that says, every time if I put something like fun into school, it would just absolutely not make it fun, because I will overanalyze it, and then it will be like, is this good for me? Is this bad for me? And then just forget about it, right? So I think if you have ever talked to students in your own research, or even just kind of on the side, I think this, I don't think this sentiment is unique to Singapore. I think students can be wary about efforts to so-called pedagogize, right, their own literacies. And there's people talking about this in literature, but my point here is that, again, like, what does this mean for critical literacy? It's an important contextual facet, in my view, that we need to consider, which is students. So, you know, the questions that are relevant here, I feel, for all of us are, do we ask students, you know, do we listen to them? Do we know what they want in terms of their literacy education? And the second one, how can we learn from or about students as the basis for critical literacy? Critical literacy is often about empowerment, right? And Elizabeth Ellsworth has a scathing critique, wrote a scathing critique. I don't know if you ever read that paper in 1989, not so much on critical literacy, but on critical pedagogy more specifically, and in a very US centered way. But still, I think some of her points are valid in terms of like the notion of empowerment, right? Is this an adult version of empowerment? And is that empowerment then? And what are we empowering them to do, right? So I think these are some of the questions that we could ask in relation to how students factor into critical literacy education. And I think that's my last slide.
Thank you so much, Csilla. That's a very thought-provoking presentation. I have quite a few questions, and they're not very neatly organized. So I'll just start with the first one that's mainly a question asking for some clarification of the Singaporean context. Given that, as you said, in Singapore, English language is a separate subject from literature, this is quite different from the way that English is structured as a school subject here, where we have the language, the literacy, and the literature strands all in the one subject. I was kind of wondering, where is critical literacy taught or supposed to be taught in Singaporean classrooms? Is it in the English language subject, or is it in the literature, or is it supposed to be across the curriculum? And what are your observations of what teachers actually do, where teachers manage to fit it in?
I think it is definitely part of the English language syllabus. It may not, so it may not be called critical literacies, but again, like, what is your definition, right? It depends. But for example, multiliteracies is majorly present now. That's like the new, really one of the new thrusts within the new syllabus. Is the importance of multiliteracies and emphasizing multiliteracies. There's also media literacy that is, at least it was in the previous syllabus. I have to check if it's in the new one. So this kind of, what critical means in the Singapore English language syllabus may not be the same as what Alan Luke means when he says critical literacy, right? So critical in Singapore often also means critical thinking skills, right? But nevertheless, issues of, for example, credibility, issues of trustworthiness, something that you would encounter in, for example, media literacy related, pedagogies, that's definitely part of the English language syllabus. The critical appreciation, critical reflection on text, I think that's very much a part of the English language syllabus. I am honestly not terribly familiar with the literature syllabus because of, I'm only dealing with English language teachers. Definitely in our project, in the project that I'm referencing here from a few years ago, we had teachers who were also teaching literature. And I could see how, for example, that's a very different way of dealing with text. What literature doesn't really do then is what we talked about earlier, this analysis of discourse. So literature will have its own traditions about how to analyze text, right? Which does not really include the kind of analysis at the textual level or multimodal level of representation that is very typically found in critical literacy. So it's kind of a tricky issue, but I would say in terms of criticality as reflecting on the message of the text and the impact of text, that's definitely a part of the English language syllabus.
Yeah, well, I wonder whether that might be presenting additional challenges in terms of how teachers manage to get to critical literacy.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that the study of literature provides us with at least one way in to thinking about how do these various discourse patterns construct broader social issues. How do they relate, in that comparative analysis of texts and so on. So it's kind of interesting that literature is dealt with completely separately. And so, notions of aesthetic appreciation and ethical issues and so on,
right.
Don't seem to sit,
no, and I think that's exactly right, that the English teachers then think, oh, this is what the literature folks do, right? So I don't have to deal with that. So this whole idea of the big picture, like what I mentioned, like the global picture or issues, like issues-based education, right? That's something literature does. And global perspectives is part of the English literature syllabus. I know that, but it's probably mentioned in the language syllabus, but the language syllabus is still very much about language and communication. So it's separating the kind of aesthetic, ethical from the critical, functional, rational, right? And as we know, that's not a good start to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other question that I wondered about, you mentioned earlier that, and in your recent paper that you sort of showed the reference at the beginning in classroom discourse, you mentioned the need for contextually relevant critical literacy foci and also a focus on the English language itself as something that is contextually relevant in Singapore, given that English has got that history as the language of the elite and also is the language associated with all of that sort of the values of that exam-driven and achievement-driven culture, I suppose. I wondered how you, whether you have any ideas, I think, or whether you've seen it perhaps in practice. How can teachers make room for that kind of focus, for focusing on the English language and as a focus of critical literacy in their classroom? And how can they do that in a way that would be safe given the Singaporean context? I thought that was a very brave talk and a very brave paper of yours that I just read in classroom discourse the other week. So yeah, I don't know whether you have any ideas about that.
Yes, thank you for the question, because it's something that I, as the paper says, I really think that there's a need for that to happen, rather than talk about inequality or poverty or race, which are obviously also relevant in Singapore. Can we talk about the role of the English language in Singapore, and the history of the English language, and also how, for example, the English language is impacting students' lives, or it's not impacting students' lives, or I don't even know where to begin with this, but definitely I think, and honestly, I don't think it's politically that contentious. I think to acknowledge, even in recent years, because the Singapore government has always kind of advocated for standard English and English as the medium of instruction in Singapore schools, and of course that remains. But I think in recent years, there's been much more of an acknowledgement of Singlish, which is the local vernacular variety of English, a lot more kind of a cultural appreciation perspective that, Singlish is a reality. You can't deny it. You can't erase it. It's there. People love it. People use it. That's what binds Singaporeans together. And I've seen it in classrooms, teachers kind of talking about it in this sense, but it's always within that sociolinguistic order, right? Which is that, Singlish has its appropriate place, which is not in the classroom. It's okay at the hawker center. It's okay, in your family or wherever, right? So the appropriate use principle, it cannot be challenged, I think. It would be too risky. So you can't do that. But what I would like to see in the critical literacy classroom is to kind of maybe bring in some of the literature perspective to help or to foster an appreciation for the language that simply doesn't exist sometimes, because students think about it. I mean, I have university students coming to me who are very smart students, and they're like, I hate English. I hate English, and it's not because of the colonial history of English. So that's another layer added onto this, right? They hate English because they've only ever been kind of looking at it in the school subject kind of sense. They don't really think about it as, for example, medium of artistic expression, an intercultural medium of language. And so I think this kind of diversification of English away from just this kind of hated school subject, I think that would be very beneficial. And the other question here, of course, is what about the mother tongue? So Singapore has, Malay, Tamil and Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and somewhat the dialects as well of Chinese. And of course, those do not really have, they have no place in the English language classroom. They're taught as mother tongues in separate subjects. But to talk about that in a critical literacy infused type of way, I think it's possible. I think it takes some finesse, and I think it takes, some kind of a balancing act from teachers. But I feel like this would be meaningful to students. But again, here is the adult educator talking. So, that's why I think we really should start having conversation with students first, and getting things from, understanding what their perspectives are. Like, I know that exam stress is a huge issue to Singaporean students, huge issue. That I could also consider that as a potential topic to tackle. In fact, in one of my projects, we tried to get the teachers to tackle it, but the teachers said, no, we don't want to do that.
Could I have time for one more question, Alice, do you think, before we open up for others to ask questions? I couldn't see any questions in the chat, so I hope it's okay to ask that. One of the issues that I experience when I teach university students, obviously, about critical literacy and what it is that often students find that I'm asking for too much, because I wouldn't accept as something, for example, a lesson as having a critical literacy focus if it only raises certain issues, and there might be issues about language and where different languages are used and so on, but it doesn't link it to specific uses of language, to specific ways of communicating, to specific patterns in texts and interactions. And I kind of wondered, what is your view on that? So how do we, it kind of gets back to my previous questions. I thought, one of the safe ways to make room for critical literacy, perhaps, and to also at the same time cater to the objectives that we're also driven by to prepare students for exams and so on, would be perhaps to start with a focus on those patterns. And in this way, they'll be learning about language, and then to look at those bigger issues. It doesn't really matter which way you start from, but as long as you have that focus on both the big issues and the patterns. Otherwise, I wouldn't call it critical literacy. I would call it critical thinking or critical, focus or something like that. So I just wondered where you stand on that.
As a critical discourse analyst, yes. Absolutely. For me, also, critical literacy needs to look at, the patterns of discourse and how, as parts of systems of representation. So, you can do that in the visual sense. And again, visual literacy is part of the English language syllabus in Singapore. So again, that's already, there's a segue into this whole idea of deconstructing, right, visuals or multimodal text. I think that's a very easy way into literacy, critical literacy. I would also, without trying to be exclusionary, but I would also say that again, remember my slide, it's about understanding language as an act of representation. If that's the view we take, then we do need to highlight why that is an act of representation. And that I feel like we can really only do if we look at the choices, right? And how choices shape text. So, which then exactly says what you were saying, which is we do need some level. And if you read any kind of a bulk of the critical literacy kind of classroom research does include this critical deconstruction, Hilary Jenks, I think, calls it deconstruction as part of the pedagogy, as part of the classroom activities. Yeah, so I would say definitely. But of course,
I think that could possibly make students feel empowered, because they've got something, they've got patterns that they can refer to in a way justify their whatever
Absolutely.
issues they think have been or should have been raised in the text but haven't been, and so on and so forth. So yeah,
I think that sometimes
something a bit more concrete.
Yeah, very definitely. I think sometimes, and I've definitely seen this, teachers think of critical literacy as something to add on. So it's not a way of teaching, about language. It's you teach language, and then comes critical literacy. And that's what I'm trying to refute in teachers, to say you can focus on structure, you can focus on report writing, you can do all of that with an understanding of looking at, okay, well, why does this text look like this? How is this text construed, and what does that mean? How it's not construed. So I think I feel like that's the biggest impediment as an educator I have, is dismantling this idea that it's an add-on. And the same goes for media literacy. It's not a way of teaching literacy. It's kind of a good to have if you have time.
Yeah.
So pervasive that it's yeah.
All right. Well, I've asked enough questions. I've got more, but I think we should open the floor for others to ask some questions.
I think we'll just type in the questions.
Or people can just unmute themselves.
I think Ruth has a question.
Yeah. So I feel like this really is how you half answered this already.
Okay.
Because if you're going to be looking for patterns, I guess my question is around to what extent is it envisaged in the curriculum documents or understood by teachers that they might use tools of description. So, there's quite a bit of meta language in our Australian curriculum now. And I think it's also at risk of being taught separately from application on texts. And that's, I think, a false dichotomy. And but yes, I was just interested to know whether that is the way it's envisaged, because there's an argument about how much you can do critical literacy without tools of analysis, I guess.
Absolutely, and I would agree with you that we do need meta language. And Victor, chime in, because you're definitely, your research has also, you've done a lot of research in this regard, and trying to get teachers to be okay with meta language, right? And kind of what is that level of meta language that teachers are still okay with and embrace, and when does it become cumbersome and too technical, where they don't see the forest for the trees. But I agree with you that meta language is absolutely important. We can't do without meta language.
And that's in your curriculum documents as well.
Meta language, I believe so. Victor, there is meta language included in the curriculum, right? The role of meta language.
Yes, at a very basic level, where they introduce the notion of semiotic modes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Csilla, for a very enjoyable and thought-provoking talk. I learned a lot. I'm particularly interested in the tensions and contradictions surfaced in the enactment of language education. You mentioned about the aims of the English syllabus and the goals of critical literacy education. So, for instance, the idea of harmony being one of the aims, as well as the value of social change as part of critical literacy education. Is it possible to reconcile them somewhat? That's one thought I have. The other thought I have is I fully agree with your statement that you made at the beginning, that critical literacy need not be only about the big issues. And I think this recognition is very important, because it can inform the practice of critical literacy in the classroom. And I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay, I'll start with the second one, because that's the one I remember better.
The first is hard to answer. I mean, it's something that I have no idea as well.
Yeah, I think definitely big issues. That's the whole idea, right? If you can do big issues, if your context, if your educational establishment is okay, is encouraging you to deal with those issues, to tackle, then that's great. But if not, that shouldn't mean that you just have to abandon critical literacy. I think it just means that as teachers and researchers working with teachers, we really need to think through these layers of context, and we really need to understand where the teachers stand. And again, because you can do critical literacy and the teachers will comply with you if you're, if you have a nice project, but as soon as you leave the school, you risk everything else going back to normal, right? I mean, that's just a general trend anyway, but I feel like what is sustainable is really, the key. And in order for us to identify these little topics, we really need to understand the contextual layers, and then sit together with the teachers and the syllabus and, with input from the students, and identify, okay, how can we do this? What is it? Where are our limits? What are we comfortable with? What are some topics that are relevant to the students as well? So I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yes, I think so. I mean, so it's really about working very closely with the teachers in that regard to identify the topics that they are. Yes. And then to push the boundary as we work together with them.
I mean, of course, professional development is part of it, you need, yes, which means you work with them, and I mean, and that's what we do in that project, in the multiliteracy project, is you still need to work with them, right? You need to talk about meta language, talk about the philosophy, but honestly, like longer term, the subject culture needs to change. As long as the subject culture doesn't change, and then that has to do also with the higher level, right? The broader sweeps of educational philosophy. If the subject culture remains the same, teachers will orient to the subject cultures, is because that's their level of accountability. Their peers, their department. And how you change subject culture, that's beyond me. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously a slow process.
Thank you.
What was your first question? Sorry.
No, the first question was essentially, I just noted when you highlighted the aims of the English language syllabus, there was this word harmony, and that struck me because earlier on you were talking about one of the purpose of language education is to prepare for social change, and I thought that was a nice contrast, and I was wondering.
It's a tension. It's a real tension.
Right? Yeah. How can we?
And colleagues in social science, social studies education have done research on this, that, I mean, teachers in Singapore are not expected to rock the boat. I mean, in fact, right? They're not, they're supposed to, represent, right? They're not supposed to rock the boat. But again, like, what does it mean to rock the boat? I mean, there's different levels of rocking the boat, right? In terms of like, I'm not talking about overtly challenging, existing governmental arrangements or policies or what have you, because it's clearly taboo. That's off the table. But there's other, but I feel like there's this general sentiment toward harmony, right? Where, any kind of potentially critical issues that come up, and it doesn't have to be related to the government, then teachers tend to shy away from, because there's this strong ethos of harmony within the teaching fraternity. Well, I shouldn't use it, the sexist term, the teaching community, right? So it's definitely palpable, the tension. And I think that's what I said, like teachers often say, like, yes, I would like to do this, but,
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
just looking to see if there are any questions that we may have missed.
Alice is asking about.
Actually asking a question that she can ask without writing it.
Yeah, I'm just following up that question, because I think it's very interesting when you talk about whether the teachers are rocking the boats or not. And then I think that the parents may be even more conservative in thinking that.
True, very true.
Their idea of the teaching of critical literacy in school.
Definitely. And you know what, how the parents come in here, not so much as they would protest against the introduction of critical literacy, but rather they would then think, and okay, this is my experience speaking, I haven't done research on parents, they would protest the idea that classroom time is taken away from more serious issues, so it's not like on political ground or an ethical ground they contest or protest, right? It's rather that they would think, just like some parents, I mean, I've talked to teachers and they say, or parents come in and they say, don't do group work because my student, it doesn't benefit from group work. I mean, this is an isolated anecdote, but maybe not. So definitely it's the whole ecology, right? But I would say with parents, the only real risk that I foresee is that it takes away from other things. We certainly, I haven't heard any complaints from parents, when we did the literacy project. But it's a good point, yeah.
And maybe if we aimed for less compartmentalization of those sort of more procedurally oriented literacy and sort of skills and knowledge about language, and that ability to, you know, talk about the bigger issues that are constructed in text and other types of interactions, I suppose, then maybe that's a way forward to be doing everything in a way that's more meaningful, but we still, you know,
I think it's for Singapore. I mean, context is hugely, it's everywhere in the syllabus, right? Context, and what might happen in the classroom is context of situation, right? But context of culture never happens. So I think, so again, like here's something like we can justify it with the syllabus. So it's, again, you're not doing anything that you're not supposed to be doing. It's just really taking the syllabus terms, right, and saying, look, when you were talking about context in relation to text, right, you can't just stop at purpose and audience, right? You really need to examine that text as it's read and written and produced and circulated within the larger, you know, sociocultural milieu. And I think that not every teacher is equipped or feels secure to be dealing with that, because it's so much more predictable to be just sticking to kind of the language structure and teaching students how to write appropriate text, you know. So it's, yeah, I mean, I don't mean to.
There's so many more questions that we can discuss, but unfortunately our seminar has come to an end. Thank you, Csilla, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you everyone who was able to join us today. And
thanks for the invitation. Thanks for showing up.
I hope we can continue the dialogue. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.